She danced with peacock feathers. She spoke 5 languages. She seduced generals, politicians, and millionaires. And in the end, she faced a firing squad, unblindfolded, unbroken, and bold enough to blow a kiss before the bullets flew. But here's the thing they don't tell you in the movies. Mata Hari, the world's most infamous spy, might never have been a spy at all. So who was she really? A traitor? A temptress? Or just a woman too clever, too ambitious, and far too alive for the world she was born into? This is the real story of Mata Hari. It's not always glamorous, it's not always fair, but it's the one she never got to tell. Hit that subscribe button, give us a like if you're ready for a tale of secrets, scandals, and survival. And let's dive into the untold life of the woman who danced her way into history. When Margaretha Zell stepped off the train in Paris in 1903, she didn't arrive with diamonds or titles, but she did carry something else, a story. And in a city obsessed with mystery, art, and performance, a good story was sometimes more valuable than gold. She introduced herself not as a Dutch divorcee with a troubled past, but as a Javanese princess, trained in the sacred dances of the East. Her name was Mata Hari, the eye of the day, she explained, as if she were sunlight in human form. It wasn't entirely a lie, not in the way people wanted it to be. She had lived in Java. She had seen the rituals. She had watched women move their arms like birds in slow motion, weaving gestures that spoke without words. But Mata Hari made those gestures her own. Her dances weren't traditional and they weren't religious, but in the dim theaters of Belle Epoque Paris, no one was coming for accuracy. They were coming for sensation. She performed barefoot, adorned in veils and jewels, with only the faintest suggestion of fabric. By the time the final piece of silk floated to the ground, the audience was in a trance. Critics called her bold, exotic, mesmerizing. She wasn't the best dancer, far from it, but she was the most unforgettable. She understood what the stage demanded, not just movement, but myth. Paris welcomed her with open arms. Overnight, she became the toast of the salons, courted by artists, diplomats, and wealthy patrons who mistook her performance for identity. Men asked where she came from, and she answered with riddles. Journalists speculated about her bloodline, calling her half Indian, half Egyptian, even part Russian. She never corrected them. Let them believe. Let them want more. Mata Hari dined in palaces and traveled with trunks full of costumes. She charmed barons and bankers, generals and spies, weaving herself into a world that would never have accepted plain Margaretha. She had no money of her own, so her survival depended on the men she attracted. But she chose them as much as they chose her. Lovers came and went, but each one gave her something: protection, connection, or just enough scandal to keep her name on everyone's lips. But success had its price. As the years passed, audiences grew accustomed to her mystery, and new performers emerged to steal the spotlight. The hunger for novelty, once her greatest asset, began to turn against her. She tried to adapt, accepting roles in operas, even posing for paintings and photographs that blurred the line between art and desire. Yet slowly, the world that had once crowned her queen of the exotic began to grow cold. Worse, she was aging. She was not yet 40, but in a business that prized youth and illusion, each wrinkle was an enemy. The men who once sent roses now sent farewells. The invitations slowed, the applause softened. Behind the glamour, there was a quiet desperation. Her daughter, the only family she had left, had been taken by her ex-husband and placed in a strict convent school. Legal battles drained her finances. Her name, once magical, was becoming a punchline in the very papers that once celebrated her. But Mata Hari was not built for obscurity. She refused to fade. When the First World War erupted in 1914, it didn't just shatter nations, it shattered lives, especially those that relied on movement, charm, and cross-border freedom. Mata Hari found herself caught between countries, between allegiances, and between truths. She still knew important men. She still had access to rooms most couldn't enter. And soon, someone would come knocking, not for a dance, but for information. By the summer of 1914, Europe was no longer a stage. It was a battlefield. The lights of Paris dimmed, the elegant salons grew quieter, and the sound of music was replaced by the distant thunder of artillery. As armies marched and borders hardened, the easy elegance that had once defined Mata Hari's world began to slip through her fingers. Her career, already in decline, now faced an invisible wall. Travel was restricted, performances were canceled, her letters were censored. Borders that had once meant adventure were now dangerous checkpoints, manned by soldiers with suspicious eyes and loaded rifles. For a woman like Mata Hari, one who had built a life on movement, on myth, on seduction and escape, the war was not just inconvenient, it was existential. Still, she refused to disappear quietly. She continued performing when she could, offering dances for charity, benefits for the wounded, or private shows for the rich and restless. But the audiences had changed. They watched with different eyes now, eyes that were afraid, hungry for distraction, but also quick to judge. The war made people moralists. Exoticism began to look like betrayal. As the front lines dragged across the continent and the bodies piled up, so did Mata Hari's debts. Her once glamorous life was now a web of unpaid bills, scattered jewelry, and fading friendships. She was growing older in a world that no longer wanted her, and for a woman who had built herself on desire, that truth cut deeper than any newspaper headline. She needed a lifeline, and then one appeared, wrapped in mystery and dressed in military uniform. In late 1916, she met a German officer in neutral Madrid. His name was Major Arnold Calais, and he introduced her to a very different stage, espionage. He offered her money in exchange for information, small details she might hear from her French and British acquaintances, pillow talk, political gossip, troop movements. He called her Agent H-21. At first, Mata Hari insisted she was never a real spy. She claimed she took the money as a gesture, something to soothe her bruised pride. But money was money, and survival doesn't always come in noble forms. Whether she intended to serve the Germans or simply thought she could outplay them remains one of the great mysteries of her story. Soon after, she approached the French. Through an old connection in French intelligence, she offered her services, this time to her adopted country, the one whose language she spoke and whose men she had loved. They accepted, or at least they pretended to. In truth, they never trusted her. The French were desperate. The war had turned bloody and directionless. Their soldiers were dying by the thousands. Morale was crumbling, and the public wanted someone to blame. A failed offensive in Verdun or a misstep in the trenches could be pinned on espionage, treason, betrayal from within. What better villain than a foreign woman, a dancer, a courtesan who had once charmed half the generals of Europe? Mata Hari found herself in the middle of a deadly game, caught between two sides who both wanted her to play a role, and neither had any intention of protecting her if the curtain fell. She traveled, met officers, attended embassies, passed along fragments of information, all while being watched, tracked, and slowly encircled. The woman who had once danced her way into the hearts of kings was now dancing on a wire, blindfolded, with enemies on all sides. and somewhere, in the darkness of wartime Paris, a decision was already being made. The hardest part about walking a tightrope isn't balance, it's knowing when it ends. And Mata Hari, for all her elegance and charm, didn't see that hers was already fraying. By early 1917, she was traveling again, from Paris to Madrid, from The Hague to Berlin, always one step ahead of the headlines, always dressed for performance. But this time, the audience wasn't made of admirers. It was made of spies. Every letter she sent, every hotel she stayed in, every whisper in a private room, all of it was being watched. To French intelligence, she was now a suspect. They claimed she passed messages to the Germans under invisible ink. They said she used coded telegrams, that she seduced officers into revealing secrets and then delivered those secrets across borders. The German military, for their part, seemed to let her believe she was useful, but never actually trusted her. To them, she was expendable, and to the French, she was becoming something worse, a convenient scapegoat. The real question was, did Mata Hari understand the game she had entered? There's little evidence she was a master spy. Her reports were vague, sometimes laughably irrelevant. One file she delivered to the French included information already printed in newspapers. In reality, Mata Hari was a performer caught in a war that no longer had space for ambiguity. The same mystery that once made her irresistible was now her greatest liability. Still, she kept playing the part. She wrote letters to her lovers with flowery declarations, unaware they were being intercepted. She attended embassy receptions, asked small questions, collected names. She thought she could remain in control. The seductress, the illusionist, always slipping between truth and performance. But the war had changed the rules, and in wartime, the margin for error disappears. In January of 1917, the trap snapped shut. The Germans sent a coded message, intercepted by the French, referring to Agent H-21, the code name they'd given to Mata Hari. To this day, historians debate whether that message was genuine intelligence or an intentional leak designed to expose her. The Germans may have burned her on purpose, feeding the French just enough to let them believe they'd caught a real spy. And the French took the bait. Back in Paris, Mata Hari was summoned to a meeting under false pretenses. She thought she'd be discussing travel documents. Instead, she walked into an ambush. Officers were waiting. She was arrested on the spot and taken to Saint-Lazare prison, not as a celebrity, not as a guest of the Republic, but as a traitor to France. What followed was a slow, humiliating unraveling. She was placed in a cold, damp cell, isolated from the world she had once commanded. Interrogators questioned her day after day. She tried to defend herself, but her answers were inconsistent. Her stories didn't align, and the men who had once fought to sit beside her at dinner now distanced themselves in silence. The newspapers, hungry for spectacle, turned on her overnight. They called her a modern Delilah, a female Judas, a snake in a dancer's costume. None of them needed proof. All they needed was a name that people remembered, and a face they could blame. Inside her cell, Mata Hari wrote letters to her lawyer, to her daughter, to the few friends who still dared to be seen near her name. She pleaded not for mercy, but for truth, to be seen finally as something more than an invention. But it was too late. The myth had consumed the woman. The elegant lies that once made her famous had turned deadly. It's strange how silence can be louder than shouting. In the months following her arrest, Mata Hari sat in her damp stone cell, waiting, not for rescue, but for the world to remember her as something more than a headline. But by then, it was far too late. Her name no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the newspapers, the courts, and the war machine that needed a villain in lipstick and jewels. When her trial began in July of 1917, it was never about facts. It was theater, a stage crafted not with curtains and lights, but with bayonets and bitterness. She stood before a military tribunal. 7 officers, no jury, no sympathy. Her lawyer, an aging and well-meaning man named Clunet, tried his best, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a glass of water. From the moment she walked in, the verdict was practically carved in stone. The prosecution painted her not just as a spy, but as a seductress who had sabotaged entire armies with her charm. They claimed her lovers had fallen not for her beauty, but into her trap, that every champagne toast and every whispered promise had been part of a grand betrayal. They didn't need hard evidence. Just the idea that a woman like her could exist was dangerous enough. It didn't help that she was foreign-born, or that she had performed in veils and bare feet, or that she had written affectionate letters to German officers, even though many of those relationships predated the war. The trial blurred the lines between her art, her lovers, and her alleged crimes until everything merged into one hazy accusation. Mata Hari had betrayed France, and people were dying because of it. She defended herself as best she could. She admitted to accepting money from a German officer, yes, but claimed it was for personal reasons, not espionage. She insisted that she had shared nothing of military value, that she had no access to classified information, and that she had offered her services to the French in good faith. She reminded them that she had danced for French soldiers, raised money for the wounded, lived openly in Paris during wartime. Would a real spy be so careless? But none of it mattered. The truth, whatever it was, had been buried beneath months of war, whispers, and headlines. In that courtroom, she wasn't a woman. She was a symbol of chaos, of seduction, of everything the army couldn't control. And symbols don't get pardoned. They get erased. The sentence was death by firing squad. She took the news with a calmness that surprised even her accusers. In her letters, she still insisted on her innocence, not as a plea, but as a final stand, the last act of a woman who had spent her life shaping her own legend. To her daughter, she wrote with tenderness, to her lawyer with gratitude, and to the world with a kind of exhausted dignity. She requested a new wardrobe for her final appearance, asking for a hat, gloves, and a tailored coat. If she was going to die, she would die as Mata Hari, not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as the character she had created, the only armor she'd ever truly had. Meanwhile, the public devoured the story like a serialized novel. Some saw her as guilty, others as misunderstood, but few saw her as human. She had become a headline with legs, a myth wrapped in silk, marching toward the end of her script. The betrayal wasn't just by governments or generals. It was by a society that never asked who she really was, only what she could represent. They had adored her when she danced, adored her when she flirted, and now they would adore her downfall, just as long as it fit the story they wanted to tell. They called it the trial of the century, but it had no reporters, no public gallery, and no real defense. There were no stirring speeches, no moments of redemption, no sharp revelations that turned the tide. What it had, instead, was a script, and Mata Hari, whether she knew it or not, had already been cast as the villain. It began on a quiet morning in July of 1917, in a small wood-paneled courtroom inside the War Ministry building in Paris. The military tribunal was composed entirely of French officers, all hardened by years of bloodshed and all desperate to show they were protecting the nation. In their eyes, failure on the battlefield could be forgiven, but failure at home required a sacrifice. They did not allow her trial to be public. They claimed it was to protect state secrets. But the real reason was simpler. They didn't want questions. They wanted closure. Fast, clean, and final. Mata Hari sat straight in her chair, wearing a dark suit, her famous flair muted but not erased. She was composed, not because she was fearless, but because she had nothing left to fear. She knew by then that the tide had turned. Her past, her dances, her lovers, her layered identity had been turned into evidence. Each performance, once seen as art, was now recast as manipulation. Each relationship, once praised as glamorous, now used to prove guilt. They presented telegrams and hotel records, fragments of testimony and intercepted letters. Most of it was circumstantial, some of it plainly unreliable. But what mattered most was not what she had done. It was what people believed she was capable of. A woman who reinvented herself, who changed names and accents, who moved freely between countries and beds. That kind of woman was dangerous. And in a time of national panic, danger didn't need to be proven. It only needed to be declared. Her lawyer, Edouard Clunet, tried to fight. He reminded the tribunal that the German code used to identify Agent H-21 had already been broken by French intelligence and could easily have been planted. He questioned the motives of her accusers and the validity of the so-called evidence. But he wasn't arguing against reason. He was arguing against a verdict that had already been written. The prosecution, on the other hand, leaned heavily into narrative. They described Mata Hari as a siren who had lured officers to their doom. They accused her of seducing secrets out of generals and delivering them to the enemy wrapped in perfume. They didn't need to tie her to any battlefield disaster. They only had to suggest that her charm had cost lives. The imagination would do the rest. For the tribunal, it was a perfect equation. The war was going badly. Morale was in ruins. What better way to reassure the public than to deliver a name, a face, and a firing squad? Mata Hari listened, mostly in silence. When asked if she had betrayed France, she answered simply, "No, never." Her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry. But behind that mask of control was something raw, not just defiance, but heartbreak. Because deep down, perhaps, she had still believed that someone would speak up, that someone, somewhere, would tell the truth. But no one did. The trial lasted just 2 days. On the third, she was found guilty of espionage, treason, and indirectly, the deaths of tens of thousands of French soldiers. The sentence was immediate and irreversible: death by firing squad. There was no applause, no final words from the judges, just silence and a woman sitting alone in a chair, her life already fading into myth. The final morning of Mata Hari's life arrived like any other in the prison at Vincennes, cold, quiet, and shrouded in fog. But she was already awake before the guards came. She hadn't slept. In truth, she hadn't really rested since the verdict was handed down. Sleep had become a stranger in those final days, replaced by long hours staring at the walls, writing letters she knew might never be delivered, and replaying memories she couldn't stop from coming back. She rose when they called her name, not slowly or reluctantly, but with a kind of grace that surprised even the guards. They brought her a black velvet coat, gloves, a simple hat. She had requested them, not out of vanity, but dignity. If she was to die, she would do so dressed, not like a criminal dragged to punishment, but like the woman she had invented, the one who had captivated audiences, seduced nations, and refused to be ordinary. The prison chaplain offered his company. She politely declined. She had never claimed to be particularly religious, and now wasn't the time to pretend. What she did ask for, softly, was a mirror. One final look at herself. They denied her even that. As she stepped into the courtyard just before dawn, The autumn air clung to her skin, damp and bitter. A firing squad of 12 soldiers waited, rifles at the ready. Nearby, a small group of witnesses stood in silence. Military officials, her lawyer Clunet, and the chaplain, hands clasped. No crowd, no last-minute reprieve, just the cold rhythm of war. They tied her to a post, but she shook her head. She didn't want to be bound, she didn't want to wear a blindfold, and, incredibly, they allowed it. So she stood, hands free, eyes open, and looked straight at the men who had come to kill her. Not defiantly, but with something deeper, something harder to define. Was it bravery, pride, or simply the strength of someone who had lived her life on stage and knew instinctively how to face an audience? Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say she smiled, others say she winked. But most agree that, just before the shots rang out, Mata Hari, Margareta Zella, lifted her chin and with a slight curve of her lips blew a kiss to the soldiers. A single command cracked through the air. The rifles fired. Her body jerked, then dropped slowly, folding in on itself like a curtain at the end of a show. A lieutenant stepped forward, pistol in hand, and delivered the final shot to her temple, the customary coup de grace. And just like that, it was over. They buried her in an unmarked grave in a Paris cemetery, along with her final possessions and what was left of her reputation. No family came to claim her body. Her daughter, hidden in a convent far from the headlines, never saw her again. Her name faded for a time, reduced to footnotes and wartime rumor, her memory caught in the murky space between scandal and history. But Mata Hari didn't vanish. Not really. In the years that followed, her story was told and retold, reshaped by filmmakers, novelists, and historians. Each version more myth than memory, more symbol than soul. She became a cautionary tale, a feminist icon, a wartime seductress, a tragic fool, a misunderstood heroine, whatever the world needed her to be at the time. Yet beneath it all was a woman who wanted to survive, who wanted beauty and movement and freedom, who tried to invent herself out of grief and ended up caught between empires, punished not for what she did, but for what she represented. They executed Mata Hari on the charge of treason, but they never really proved she was a spy. Years passed. The war ended. Monuments were built. Generals retired with medals pinned to their chests, and the world tried to stitch itself back together. For most, Mata Hari's name faded into a curious footnote, the exotic dancer who dared to play at espionage and paid for it with her life. But history has a way of hiding things in the quiet corners, and in the decades that followed, those corners began to crack open. In the 1950s, and again in the 2000s, declassified intelligence files emerged, documents once buried under layers of secrecy and dust. They revealed what many had long suspected and what others had refused to believe. The case against Mata Hari was built more on suggestion than substance. There was no smoking gun, no secret document with her name on it, no intercepted message that proved beyond doubt that she had betrayed anyone. Even the infamous telegram that sealed her fate, the one sent by German intelligence referring to Agent H-21, was full of ambiguity. Scholars now believe it may have been a deliberate German deception. They knew the French had cracked their code. It's entirely possible that they planted her name, knowing the French would bite. A misdirection, a distraction, a sacrifice. After all, in the eyes of the Germans, Mata Hari was of little value. She had produced nothing of strategic importance. And in wartime, misinformation can be more powerful than any bullet. French intelligence, desperate to demonstrate results in a war that was unraveling, seized on the chance to make an example. Her gender, her independence, her refusal to conform, All of it made her the perfect villain in a story that needed one. She wasn't convicted for being a master spy. She was convicted for being visible, foreign, and unrepentantly herself. The truth, it seems, is that Mata Hari was never a serious player in the world of espionage. She was, at best, a hopeful amateur, a woman trying to stay afloat in a war-torn Europe by leveraging the only assets she had left: charm, access, and a name people remembered. In the shadowy, male-dominated world of intelligence, she was never in control. She was used, misled, and finally discarded. And still, the legend grew. She became cinema's favorite archetype, the femme fatale in silk and shadow, using seduction as her deadliest weapon. But the woman beneath the myth was more complicated. She wasn't fearless. She wasn't cold. She wasn't even particularly political. She was a mother, a performer, a survivor of abuse and loss, a woman who had lived through a collapsing marriage, the death of a child, and the relentless judgment of a world that decided early on what she was allowed to be. That world turned her into a symbol of treachery, of moral decay, of the dangers of female sexuality, and then destroyed her for it. What's most tragic, perhaps, is that Mata Hari didn't need to be a spy to be executed. Her life alone, her choices, her presence, that was enough. Enough to stir gossip, enough to rattle the patriarchy, enough to make her dangerous to men who had always decided the rules. And now, more than a century later, we're still trying to separate the woman from the legend. We're still asking, who was she really? Was she a liar? Absolutely. She lied about her past, her identity, her origins. But so did the men who prosecuted her. So did the countries that used her name to cover their own failures. In a war built on propaganda and illusion, she was simply better at telling stories, until the story swallowed her whole. It's been more than 100 years since Mata Hari faced a line of rifles in a foggy Paris courtyard, but her shadow hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's grown longer, more mysterious, and more tangled in the stories we tell about women, power, and punishment. Because even now, her name still rings with that electric mix of seduction and scandal. She's been called a temptress, a traitor, a siren, a fool, rarely a mother, rarely a woman caught between forces she couldn't control. The real Mata Hari has been buried beneath layers of fiction, by novels, by films, by historians too eager to chase the drama and too unwilling to question the narrative that sealed her fate. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand. She wasn't killed for what she did. She was killed for what she symbolized. In the eyes of a frightened military and a country breaking under the weight of war, Mata Hari became the embodiment of fear. Fear of the outsider, fear of female independence, fear of sexuality that couldn't be controlled. She was exotic, foreign, outspoken, and unwilling to apologize for any of it. She didn't play small. She didn't fade into the background. She didn't lower her eyes. And history has never been kind to women like that. Her story reminds us how quickly a woman's body can be turned into a battlefield, how a dancer becomes a danger, how flirting becomes fatal, how mystery becomes a crime. In many ways, Mata Hari was ahead of her time. She built a brand before branding existed. She created a persona so alluring that it seduced not just audiences, but entire nations. She moved through the world with an awareness of image and spectacle that most performers today would admire. But in the end, the very myth she built turned against her. That's the paradox at the heart of her story. She was punished for performing too well, for turning herself into a symbol, and then being blamed for it. And once that symbol no longer served the men around her, it was easier to shoot the myth than to question the machinery that created it. Today, We might recognize Mata Hari in every woman who's ever been judged more for how she looks than what she says, in every figure who's been elevated for charm, then discarded when her confidence became inconvenient, in every case where ambiguity is treated like guilt and complexity is dismissed as dishonesty. Was she perfect? No. She made mistakes, naive ones, perhaps reckless ones. She overestimated her influence and underestimated the cruelty of the world she lived in. But to call her a traitor is to ignore everything else she was. A survivor, a mother denied her child, an artist without a stage, a woman dancing through fire because it was the only way she knew to live. In her final letter to her lawyer, she wrote, "I am innocent. Someone should try to understand me." That's what this story has tried to do, not to excuse her, not to glorify her, but to understand her as a human being, not just a headline. So next time you hear her name, remember not just the veils and the verdict. Remember the girl from the Netherlands, the woman who lost a son in a foreign land, the artist who refused to fade. Remember the way she stood without a blindfold, in front of 12 guns, and still managed to blow a kiss. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is live loudly in a world that demands silence. History has a habit of turning people into symbols, and in times of revolution, no one is safe, not even kings. So now, let's step out of the shadow of veils and spies and walk into the cold, creaking corridors of Versailles, where power looked eternal. But one man, quiet, indecisive, and tragically human, would lose not only his crown, but his head. This is the true story of Louis XVI, the last king of France before the guillotine came calling. The king who lost his head, the tragic fall of Louis XVI. Before the revolution, before the guillotine, before the cries for liberty and equality echoed across Paris, there was just a quiet, awkward boy named Louis. Not the 14th, not the 15th, just Louis. A child born into a golden cage, padded with velvet and rules. Louis XVI was never supposed to be king. He was the second son, bookish and soft-spoken, a boy more interested in locks and languages than politics and power. His older brother, the confident and favored heir, was the one trained to rule. But when sickness swept through the royal household, the line of succession shifted. Louis found himself standing in his brother's shoes, and they never really fit. His father died young, and suddenly the boy who had once been invisible was now the Dauphin, the crown prince of France. At 11 years old, he was already being groomed for a job he hadn't asked for, while courtiers whispered behind fans about his clumsiness, his shyness, his lack of flair. Compared to the legacy of his great-great-grandfather, the Sun King, Louis seemed like a flickering candle in a grand hall. In an effort to strengthen ties between old enemies, France arranged for young Louis to marry an Austrian princess. Her name was Maria Antonia, later known to history as Marie Antoinette, and she was only 14 when she arrived in Versailles, powdered, perfumed, and utterly foreign. The two teenagers, forced into this political marriage, had little in common. He was shy and solitary. She was lively, impulsive, and struggling to find her footing in a court that viewed her as an outsider. The early years of their marriage were awkward. They barely spoke, their differences too vast and their duties too heavy. Rumors swirled about their lack of intimacy, feeding into the gossip-hungry court and weakening their public image before they had even begun to rule. But the real burden fell on Louis. His grandfather, Louis XV, reigned for nearly 60 years, and by the end had turned France into a kingdom with crumbling finances and deep inequality. When the old king finally died in 1774, the crown passed to young Louis, just 20 years old, thoughtful, overwhelmed, and totally unprepared. He stepped onto the throne with a genuine desire to do good. He was not cruel. He was not arrogant. In fact, his greatest flaw may have been the opposite. He was too uncertain, too eager to please, too unwilling to take bold steps when boldness was exactly what the country needed. The Palace of Versailles was still dazzling, its halls echoing with wealth and tradition. But outside its golden gates, the people of France were starving. Bread prices soared. Taxes crushed the poor while the nobles dined undisturbed. The old order, built on hierarchy and inherited privilege, was beginning to crack, and the new king didn't seem to know how to hold it together. His ministers urged reform. Some called for tax relief. Others begged for cuts to the royal budget. But Louis hesitated. He shuffled through advisors like a man changing clothes in the dark, hoping one of them might fix the country for him. And while he delayed, resentment festered. The people were no longer content to suffer in silence. Enlightenment ideas were spreading, of rights, of liberty, of equality, and they didn't pair well with diamond necklaces and palace balls. Still, inside the court, life moved on as if nothing had changed. Marie Antoinette threw masked parties and indulged in extravagant fashions. Louis tinkered with metal locks in his private workshop, trying to solve puzzles with gears and tumblers, while his kingdom began to wobble like a top running out of spin. He was a good man, many would later say. Kind, moral, dutiful. But history is rarely written by kindness. It's written by the consequences of action, or inaction. When Louis XVI became king in the year 1774, he was just 20 years old. France at the time was still dressed in gold. On the outside, the Palace of Versailles shimmered. The court danced. But beneath that shine, the country was slowly falling apart. The treasury was bleeding. Wars, including France's recent support of the American Revolution, had left the nation deeply in debt. Food shortages were growing worse. The tax system was a patchwork of privilege, where the poorest paid the most and the wealthiest, the nobility and clergy, paid nothing at all. Louis knew something had to change. He just didn't know how to change it. At heart, he was a reformer. He believed in education. He believed in fairness. He believed, perhaps too strongly, that problems could be solved if people just listened to reason. But he wasn't raised to rule with force or fire. He was raised to preserve a system built on ceremony and caution. So when crisis came knocking, Louis opened the door slowly, and then stood there, unsure of what to do next. His first step was to appoint reform-minded ministers. One of the most promising was Jacques Turgot, who proposed cutting the lavish spending of the royal court and taxing the aristocracy. It was bold, it was necessary, and it was never going to happen. The nobility revolted, not with swords, but with pressure, politics, and manipulation. Within 2 years, Turgot was gone. After him came Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker with a talent for public relations. He published France's budget, a radical move meant to show transparency. But the numbers were carefully cleaned up, hiding the depth of the financial crisis. Necker became popular with the people, which made him deeply unpopular at court. He was dismissed, reinstated, then dismissed again. This cycle repeated itself. New ministers, new ideas, new resistance. Each time Louis hesitated. He hated conflict. He hated disappointing people. But in trying to please everyone, he pleased no one. He alienated reformers by yielding to the nobles and angered the nobles by even considering reform. Meanwhile, France was boiling. The cost of bread, the staple of the poor, had risen beyond reach. People stood in long lines, only to leave with empty baskets and bitter hearts. In cities and villages, voices began to rise, in pamphlets, in salons, in whispered conversations that turned sharper with each passing season. The Enlightenment was no longer just philosophy, it was politics now. People spoke of natural rights, of liberty, of representation. Writers like Rousseau and Voltaire had planted the seeds, and now those seeds were sprouting into demands. The idea that kings ruled by divine right was beginning to rot. Louis, sensing the danger, took a step he believed would show good faith. He called for a meeting of the Estates General, the representative body of the clergy, nobility, and common people. It hadn't met in over 170 years. He hoped it would calm the nation, remind the people that they had a voice. But he was about to learn that giving the people a voice is not the same as being ready to listen. In the spring of 1789, France was a country divided by more than wealth. It was divided by the illusion that the old world could survive the weight of a new one. The king still lived in Versailles, surrounded by mirrors and marble. But the people, the vast, aching majority, were crowding into narrow streets and empty markets, clutching empty coins and watching their children cry from hunger. Bread had always been the heartbeat of French life, but now it was vanishing. The price had doubled in just a few years. Bakers were guarded by soldiers. Flour was stolen in the dark. In Paris, people stood in line before sunrise, hoping for a loaf that never came. The country wasn't starving, it was simmering. And at the center of their rage stood a woman who hadn't created the crisis, but who had become its symbol, Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born queen had always been viewed with suspicion. Her accent, her fashion, her parties, all were seen as foreign, extravagant, and out of touch. But now, with children dying of hunger and the state nearly bankrupt, she became the lightning rod for all of France's fury. When someone reported that, upon hearing the poor had no bread, she said, "Let them eat cake," the phrase exploded like wildfire. Historians today agree she probably never said it. But it didn't matter. Truth was already irrelevant. The people didn't need accuracy. They needed a villain. And Marie, with her towering hair and sparkling gowns, fit the role too perfectly. Inside Versailles, life still went on. Dances, dinners, debates over lace and etiquette. But the mood had shifted. Even the nobles could feel the weight of change. Rumors of revolution drifted in like smoke. The Estates General, the king's attempt at reform, was finally about to meet for the first time in over 175 years. It was supposed to be a gesture. 3 groups would be represented: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, also known as the Third Estate. But from the start, it was clear the deck was stacked. The First and Second Estates, though much smaller in number, held just as much voting power as the Third. The people were present, but they were not equal. The delegates of the Third Estate were a different breed. They were lawyers, writers, and merchants, educated, frustrated, and ready. When it became obvious that their voices would be drowned out, they walked out. Locked out of their meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and made a promise, the tennis court oath, vowing not to separate until they had written a new constitution for France. For the first time in living memory, the king's subjects weren't asking, they were declaring. Louis XVI, watching from a palace built to keep the world at bay, now found that the world had climbed over the gates. His advisors urged him to crush the rebellion, to dissolve the assembly, to show strength. But Louis hesitated. He feared civil war. He feared bloodshed. And perhaps deep down, he believed in compromise. But revolutions do not wait for uncertainty. And then came the spark. On the 14th of July, The people of Paris stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that stood as a symbol of royal tyranny. They weren't just looking for weapons. They were looking for proof that they could take power into their own hands. And they did. Heads were raised on pikes. Guards were killed. And across the city, church bells rang not for worship, but for uprising. The monarchy was still alive, but the idea of royal invincibility had been broken. In the weeks after the Bastille fell, France changed, not all at once, but in tremors, like a glass beginning to crack. Old structures didn't shatter immediately, but they began to shake in ways they never had before. The streets of Paris buzzed with energy and rumors. Something had broken open, and now nothing felt entirely under control. The National Assembly, born from the defiance of the Third Estate, was no longer just a rogue gathering of frustrated men. It had become the voice of the people. They were no longer content to beg for representation. They were drafting laws, debating rights, and transforming themselves into something new. They called it the National Constituent Assembly, and they had one clear mission: to write a constitution. Louis XVI didn't dissolve them. He didn't attack. Instead, he made a choice that would echo through history. He accepted the assembly, at least publicly. He stood before them and promised to work with this new body. He hoped that by appearing reasonable, he could keep the monarchy intact. He was wrong, because outside the assembly's walls, the people were hungry, not just for food, but for justice. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted, proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity. Words that had once belonged to philosophers now belonged to farmers, tailors, and servants. And they wanted more than words. They wanted results. Marie Antoinette remained the symbol of royal arrogance. Her face appeared in cartoons and pamphlets, often in grotesque exaggeration. Her every move was scrutinized, twisted into evidence of indifference or treachery. She retreated into the private apartments of Versailles, increasingly isolated and defiant, clinging to ceremony while the world outside boiled. Then came the women. On the 5th of October, thousands of market women in Paris, furious over bread shortages and enraged by rumors of a royal banquet mocking the revolution, marched to Versailles. These were not noble women with fans and lace. These were mothers with calloused hands and empty stomachs, and they were done waiting. They stormed the palace gates, forced their way into the royal chambers, and demanded that the king return with them to Paris, not as a guest, as a prisoner of the people. Louis XVI had no choice. He, Marie, and their children were escorted back under heavy guard, surrounded by crowds chanting and waving pikes. Some carried loaves of bread aloft like trophies. Others carried the heads of royal guards on spikes. The royal family was relocated to the Tuileries Palace, less a palace, more a gilded cage in the center of revolutionary Paris. They were no longer unreachable. They were visible, vulnerable, and increasingly irrelevant. Yet even here, Louis tried to hold on. He signed decrees from the assembly. He appeared in public. He tried politely to rule, as if the world hadn't already shifted beneath his feet. But the monarchy was no longer leading events. It was reacting to them, day by day, with less and less control. As debates raged and the new constitution neared completion, Louis had a choice: accept a limited monarchy, or fight to reclaim absolute power. He hesitated. He hoped for outside help. He dreamed of restoring order, but he didn't act. Not yet. In the streets, people read newspapers and listened to speeches that once would have been treason. Now they were just daily conversation. The idea of a king who governed by divine right began to sound like a joke or a threat. The revolution was no longer a moment. It was becoming a movement. By the winter of 1789, the King of France was no longer ruling, he was simply enduring. Louis XVI, once seated atop the most opulent monarchy in Europe, now lived under close watch in the Tuileries Palace, a gray stone building in the middle of a restless city. He was not in prison, not officially, but he might as well have been. Each morning he rose to the sounds of crowds gathering outside, chanting slogans about liberty and justice. The royal guards were now revolutionaries in uniform, and even the palace maids had opinions about the fate of the monarchy. The family, Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children, lived in a constant state of public exposure. Every meal, every walk, every gesture was watched. The National Assembly continued its work with growing confidence. In August, they passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a thunderclap of ideals that stripped away the old order with a few elegant phrases. All men are born free and equal. Sovereignty belongs to the people. The law is the same for everyone. Louis signed it. He didn't want to, but he did. He knew that refusing would ignite fury, so he gave his approval, hoping it would buy him time, maybe even a little mercy. But signing the declaration didn't make him a revolutionary. It made him a king trying to survive in a country that no longer wanted kings. His royal title remained, but his power was gone. Each day the assembly cut deeper into the roots of monarchy, abolishing noble privileges, rewriting laws, creating departments, issuing paper money. They did not consult him. They did not wait for permission. And outside the assembly halls, Paris was changing too. Church bells were replaced by speeches. Clergy were now required to swear loyalty to the revolution. Streets that once bore the names of saints were renamed for liberty and reason. People began to wear the tricolor, red, white, and blue, not just on their clothes, but in their hearts. The court still held dinners, but they felt hollow. Marie Antoinette withdrew further, haunted by fear and fury. She wrote letters in secret, begging her Austrian relatives to intervene, to send troops to rescue the family. Louis, for his part, studied maps and escape routes. He still believed in divine order, but he was beginning to understand that divine order wouldn't save him. The royal family had become a symbol, not of power, but of division. To some, they were still sacred. To others, they were parasites. And to many, they were just confused, outdated relics in a world that had outgrown them. In June of 1791, Louis made a decision. He would flee. It was bold, desperate, risky, but he believed that if he could reach the border and join loyalist forces, he might still reclaim control. The plan was to dress in disguise, he as a valet, the queen as a governess, and slip away by night in a large coach. They would travel over 150 miles to Montmédy, near the Austrian border. But the plan was doomed from the start. The coach was too large, too slow, too conspicuous. At nearly every stop, someone recognized them. They didn't blend in, they stood out. Their wealth, their manners, even their silence spoke volumes. In the town of Varennes, just a few miles from safety, they were stopped. A local postmaster recognized the king from his face on coins. A message was sent. Guards arrived. The royal family was arrested, surrounded by angry citizens, and escorted back to Paris in shame. Their escape attempt had failed, but something else had succeeded. The illusion that Louis XVI was still a king in any real sense, that illusion was gone. The failed escape to Varennes was more than just a royal blunder. It was a turning point. Until that moment, many in France still believed in the possibility of a constitutional monarchy. They imagined Louis XVI as a king who could change with the times, who could adapt to a new France. But once he tried to flee, that belief snapped like a dry branch. He had promised to support the new government. He had signed the Declaration of Rights. He had nodded and smiled through revolutionary reforms. And yet, when no one was looking, he packed his bags and tried to run. The people felt betrayed, not just by a ruler, but by a symbol they had clung to in hopes of peaceful change. When the royal family was marched back to Paris under armed guard, crowds lined the streets in stony silence. No jeers, no cheers, just thousands of eyes watching the man who had lied to them. For the first time, they didn't call him Your Majesty. They called him Louis Capet, stripping him of his title, and with it, his identity. Inside the Tuileries Palace, the mood turned grim. The guards doubled. The windows stayed closed. The royal children whispered. Marie Antoinette, once bold and theatrical, became sharper, colder. She wrote letter after letter to her brother, the Emperor of Austria, pleading for military intervention. She wanted rescue. She wanted revenge. But the walls were closing in faster than anyone expected. The National Assembly, stunned by the attempted escape, still tried to hold the line. They finished drafting the new constitution and declared France a constitutional monarchy, at least on paper. Louis was restored to a kind of symbolic throne, but everyone knew it was fiction. He had no authority. His words no longer mattered. And outside the palace, Paris was changing into something dangerous. Political clubs multiplied, the Jacobins, the Cordeliers, fiery groups where speeches burned hotter than bonfires. Newspapers fanned the flames of public outrage. Pamphlets called the king a traitor, the queen a spy. Every tavern echoed with angry debates. Every market square became a platform for revolution. The fear of foreign invasion added fuel. Austria and Prussia, nervous about the spread of revolutionary ideas, warned France to leave the royal family untouched. But instead of calming things down, the threat poured oil on the fire. People asked, if the king had allies abroad, wasn't that treason? If he had begged foreign monarchs to invade his own country, wasn't that betrayal? In April of 1792, France declared war on Austria, a war started not by monarchs, but by a revolutionary government that believed it had to fight or be destroyed. Louis XVI watched from behind palace walls as his country went to war in his name, a country that no longer trusted him, led by a government that barely tolerated his existence. Soon after, mobs stormed the Tuileries Palace again, demanding answers, demanding blood. They wanted the king to wear the red liberty cap, the symbol of revolution. Louis obliged. He stood silently as radicals shouted around him, a king with no power left, wearing the costume of the people who hated him. The situation could not hold. Revolution is a wave, and it doesn't stop mid-crash. And now, the revolution had moved beyond reform. It was ready to erase the past entirely. By the summer of 1792, the throne of France stood on hollow legs. The war against Austria was going badly. The economy was worse. The streets of Paris were brimming with anger, hunger, and something far more dangerous. A sense that history was waiting to be made, with or without the king. The people no longer whispered about removing the monarchy. They shouted it in newspapers and cried it out in the streets. The question was no longer whether the monarchy should fall, but when. On the 10th of August, that question was answered with violence. Tens of thousands of revolutionaries, many of them poor, many armed with nothing but farming tools and fury, marched on the Tuileries Palace. The National Guard, once loyal to the king, now stood aside. The Swiss Guards, loyal but outnumbered, fought to protect the royal family. It was a massacre. Bodies filled the palace courtyards. Blood soaked the marble floors. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their children barely escaped with their lives. They fled to the nearby Legislative Assembly and begged for protection. But the Assembly was no longer their ally. It voted to suspend the monarchy. Louis was no longer king. He was now just a man under arrest. The royal family was imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress turned jail. It was dark, damp, and full of echoes. For the first time in his life, Louis wore no crown, gave no orders, received no bows. The children were kept under lock and key. The queen wept in private. The king prayed and waited. Outside, Paris unraveled. In September, as rumors swirled that foreign armies were nearing the capital, mobs stormed the prisons and murdered thousands of prisoners. Nobles, priests, and anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary leanings. They called it justice. Others called it madness. It was later remembered as the September Massacres. In this chaos, the newly elected National Convention declared the monarchy officially abolished. France would now be a republic, a nation not ruled by bloodlines, but by the will of the people, at least in theory. But what to do with the former king? Many argued for exile, others wanted lifelong imprisonment, but the radicals, especially the Jacobins, led by voices like Robespierre, demanded something final, something that would prove the revolution could not be reversed. They wanted execution. Louis XVI had done little to inspire hatred. He was not a tyrant in the classical sense. He hadn't crushed rebellions or executed rivals. He was indecisive, overly trusting, passive in the face of rising disaster. But to the revolution, that made him worse. He had allowed injustice by doing nothing. He had betrayed the nation with his silence. And now, they said, silence would not save him. The trial was announced, not in secret, not in private, but before the entire nation. For the first time in modern history, a king would be tried by his own people. The courtroom was packed. The charges were heavy: treason, conspiracy, crimes against liberty. Louis sat quietly, listening, occasionally taking notes. He denied nothing, but defended his actions as those of a man trying to preserve order, not crush freedom. The convention debated for days. The vote came down to this: should Louis Capet, no longer king, be executed? The answer, by a narrow margin, was yes, and the sentence would be carried out without delay. In the early days of January 1793, the man once called the most Christian king sat in a prison cell, waiting for death. The iron crown of reality had long since replaced the golden one of ceremony. Louis XVI was no longer a ruler, no longer a symbol of divine right, only a man, bearded now, pale and heavy-hearted, trying to make peace with the end. His trial had shocked Europe. Monarchs from Vienna to London watched in disbelief as a sitting king was judged by the people he once ruled. It was not just a political act. It was a revolution in thought. The divine right of kings, the idea that rulers were chosen by God and untouchable by common law, had been broken, and it had been broken by vote. The charges against him were extensive: collusion with foreign powers, attempts to undermine the Constitution, betrayal of the revolution. The evidence included secret letters, intercepted communications, and the memory of his failed flight to Varennes. But what truly sealed his fate wasn't what he did, it was what he represented. To the revolution, Louis was not just a traitor. He was the living embodiment of the old world they were trying to erase. Louis defended himself calmly. He spoke with quiet dignity, denying that he had ever conspired to harm the nation. He said he had always acted in good faith, always tried to preserve peace, always placed France above all else. His words, even his composure, surprised many. He wasn't mad. He wasn't cruel, but he was, by revolutionary standards, unforgivable. The final vote took place in stages. First, was he guilty? The answer came back overwhelmingly, yes. Then, should there be a public referendum on his sentence? That was voted down. Finally, what would his punishment be? Each member of the convention stood and gave their vote aloud, one by one, in front of each other, in front of history. Some hesitated, some whispered, some spoke boldly. But in the end, by a margin of just one vote, the verdict was decided. Death. Not exile, not imprisonment. Death. Louis received the news with quiet resolve. He asked to see his confessor. He requested that his family be allowed to visit. And he asked only one thing of the executioners, that the blade be quick. On the morning of the 21st of January, he rose early. He dressed simply, in a plain white shirt, a dark coat, and breeches. He refused to be bound, but when the guards insisted, he did not resist. He walked out into the freezing air without a crown, without a throne, without a nation. The scaffold had been erected in the Place de la Révolution, the former Place Louis XV, a grim irony lost on no one. A crowd had gathered, thousands strong. Some were silent, others jeered, but all were witnesses. Louis mounted the steps slowly. At the top, he tried to speak. He began, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me." But a drum roll drowned his voice. The executioners moved quickly. They tied his hands, positioned him beneath the blade. The executioner's assistant adjusted the lunette, the wooden collar that would hold his neck. At 22 minutes past 10 in the morning, the blade fell. The king's head was raised aloft for all to see, and France was changed forever. There was no royal funeral, no eulogy, just a nation stunned by its own act, standing at the edge of something new and uncertain. The blade had done its work, but the story didn't end at the scaffold. Louis XVI was gone, but his shadow stretched across the next century, lingering not just in palaces and portraits, but in the questions his death left behind. What does it mean to kill a king? Some said it was justice, a necessary break with tyranny. Others said it was murder, dressed up as democracy. But almost everyone, even some who cheered that cold January morning, felt something unsettling in the silence that followed. The king had been removed, but the revolution was not finished. In truth, it had only begun to devour itself. In the weeks that followed, his wife, Marie Antoinette, would be tried and executed. Their son, the young Louis Charles, would die in prison, alone and sick. The monarchy was erased, not just by law, but by force, by forgetting, by fire. And yet, Louis XVI would not be entirely forgotten. For decades, monarchists painted him as a martyr, a good-hearted man who fell victim to the madness of crowds. Revolutionary thinkers, meanwhile, remembered him as a symbol, not of evil, but of everything that had to be swept away. A man who, through weakness and inaction, allowed injustice to fester. In their eyes, he was not a monster. He was a missed opportunity. And maybe that is the tragedy. Louis was not a tyrant. He was not bloodthirsty or cruel. He did not rule with an iron fist, but he did rule with hesitation, with passivity, with the hope that old systems could survive simply by enduring. When change knocked on the door, he opened it slowly, then stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or slam it shut. He wanted to be a good king, but the time for kings had passed. His story became a warning for rulers everywhere, about the danger of delay, about the illusion of invincibility, about the cost of living in mirrors while the world outside is catching fire. In the years that followed his death, France would swing wildly, from republic to terror to empire, and back again. Blood would run through Paris more than once. Napoleon Bonaparte would rise, proclaiming a new kind of monarchy in all but name. The guillotine would be raised again and again, and not just for kings. And through it all, the memory of Louis XVI sat quietly in the background, not as a roaring figure of history, but as a quiet one. The king who lost his head not because he ruled too strongly, but because he didn't rule at all. He remains a reminder that power is not only taken with cruelty, it can also slip away through kindness, through compromise, through the belief that tomorrow will somehow fix today. He believed in peace, but revolutions are not built on belief. They are built on action. So when we remember Louis XVI, not the crown, not the velvet, but the man, we see not a villain, but a question. What happens when the world changes, and you don't?